He wants to help the youth. And David says, I think he's just looking to balloon stock prices. I think that's just about all we're into here. And I said, no, he's a very nice man. A very nice man, David repeated. Well, let's take a look at this, he said, this interview on your show. Do we have this here? Robert C. Wright and Glendora helping the youth, a chat with Glendora.
And then we got, General Electric acquired RCA. And then I came over from General Electric to become the president of NBC. And that's how I got here.
Oh, it's such an interesting career. And that's how you ended up in Fairfield, because I think General Electric's table was centered in Fairfield, wasn't it?
Yes, I actually never worked in Fairfield.
Oh, you never did?
No, I've worked, most recently my office was in Stamford, Connecticut before I came here.
Oh.
Although I live in that area, but I didn't work there.
I see, yeah. This is Mr. Robert C. Wright, who is the president and chief executive officer of NBC. And he'll be back in just a second and tell you what his work is like, to see if you'd like to aim for that as a career. And then he'll also give you some ideas how to get started in broadcasting in today's world.
And David Letterman said, yeah. And then there was a lot of cheering and a lot of laughter and a lot of applause. And David Letterman says, it seems like you and he were dressed alike. And that, of course, was very funny. But I should have told David Letterman, yes, I was dressed like Robert Wright, but I was also dressed like David Letterman. I had on my David Letterman shoes. Well, he continued to press his point. He says, I don't want to linger on this. He says, but how did General Electric's acquisition of RCA, how did that ultimately help the youth of this country? To which the audience laughed heartily. And I should have told David then that if you're right, you can't be wrong. David continued, what helped the youth, I tried to tell him, what helped the youth was Mr. Wright's, how he got started, because he was at the same, and David says, I see occasional information. I said, yeah, but he was at the same point in his development as the youth who watch the program are, we hope, in theirs. And David says, I see. Then he says, tell me, what is your personal recipe for happiness? You're known as the, I'll tell you, he says, oh yes. He says, you're known as the happiness lady. Is that what they call you? And I said, no. And he says, well, what do they call you? And he really had me there for a minute, and then I told him, Glendora. And then I said to him, and what did you say your name was? And he says, I'm David. He says, and this is my last night. And I told him then that, I said, David, you're a very good interviewer. He says, oh, well, thank you. And I said, I'm going to recommend you for a raise. And then he said, thank you. And I said, the recipe for happiness? Well, David, there's one thing in this world that you can do better than anybody else. And if you'll go by yourself, you'll find out what that is, and you will do it, and you'll be happy. Now, if you don't, David, it's going to nag at you every second of your life. And David says, than anybody else. The one thing that you can do better than anybody else, he repeated, and you concentrate on that. And I said, yes, you do, and then you'll be happy. And he said, and then that will make you happy? And I said, well, sure, because then you'll get everything you want. He says, yeah. And it's the way he said, yeah, that made the audience laugh. And then he leaned over and he says, and the Vegalinks? He says, vegetable protein, no meat at all in here, right? And I says, no meat. He says, well, geez, Glendora. He says, good luck with the show. I said, thank you very much. And he says, I hope you can come back and see us again. And I says, okay, I'd like to do that very much. Now, is that, would that take 1 day or 2 days? And, of course, the audience had him on that one. And David says, ha, ha. He says, oh, he says, that's right. You were supposed to be here the first night. He says, well, okay. He says, we have to go now. We have other guests. Thank you very much. And then again, I gave him a double handshake. And that was the end of it. And then up came one of the pictures. You know, they have these stills. And up came a picture of a New York City vendor with a big umbrella. And he was selling sausages. Of course, that was in order of the Vegelinks. I didn't get a chance to ask him if his father worked for the United States Post Office. I assumed he was, because after all, he was a letterman. And I called Kathy Michalsick, and I asked her to send me copies of the contract, and they did that. And then the Monday following, less than a week, a huge check came. It was for almost $1,000. It was for $480 for each night. I think that had something to do with my belonging to the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists. And the government took about a third of that. And then what else happened? Oh, I called and I asked if David Letterman could be a guest on A Chat with Glendora. And I guess I pretty much got the impression that, well, and somebody, quote, unquote, said, he doesn't do anything. So I guess that's not going to happen. And I called and I asked to have permission to play the segment, the 7-minute segment, on A Chat with Glendora. But he wouldn't grant that either, or any part of it. So since it had already been laid down on the program, I had to tell Manhattan Cable TV and Paragon Cable TV to put up a slate to do the first part of the program, which was the interview with Margaret Smithberg, and then when they came to the part with David Letterman, to go to black and put up a slate over that standby, and then go on to the next interview. And then at UA Columbia, I had to go over there and get that tape and edit out the David Letterman part, and I covered it up with Glendora jokes. So that's about how that went. It's too bad that I couldn't have played for you. It was a lot of fun to see it. And then about a week later, I got a call from a very arrogant NBC lawyer, an NBC attorney, and he said he was going to put an injunction on the show not to play it because of the David Letterman segment was in there. And I should have gone, let him go ahead and do that. That would have been a great laugh, because he had the wrong show in mind. Because he called after the supposedly David Letterman spot had been played, which it hadn't been played. So I should have let him go ahead, because he was talking about the wrong show. But I couldn't do that for the sake of the people who were on that second show. They had to see that. And so I guess that's all of the excitement and all of the fireworks. It sure was a thrill, and it was sure funny throughout the whole thing. It was a lot of fun. So that's Glendora on A Chat with Glendora on David Letterman. And he covered the three things: the Glendora Happy Book, and A Chat with Glendora, and Glendora Cheerful Look at Life. And you keep your courage flaming. Hi there, everybody. How are you today? Welcome to Glendora Cheerful Look at Life. Bob says that he does his hardest work before breakfast. And Pete says, what is that? And Bob says, getting up. And Jimmy had a birthday party, and he invited 2 grandparents, 4 uncles, and 2 aunts. And his mother says, everybody that you've invited to the party is older. And Jimmy says, well, they seem to be the ones with the money. Now, Bob and Mary were on a cruise. And Mary was talking to another passenger, Joan. And Mary says, I like my cabin very much, but I don't like the washing machine on the wall. And Joan says, that's not a washing machine, that's a porthole. And Mary says, gee, I guess that's why I never got my clothes back. Now, Mrs. Morgan was teaching her 4th graders, and she says, use the word bewitches in a sentence. And Bobby thought a little while, and then he says, you go ahead, and I'll bewitches in a minute. And as I was saying about Bob and Mary on their cruise, Bob said to Mary, did you ever see anybody eat as much as that man who sat across the table from us at lunch? And Mary says, no, I never did. She says, it must be what they call a ship stowaway. And Pete was asked, if your mother gave you a big apple and a small apple and told you to share it with your brother, which apple would you give your brother? And Pete says, you mean my big brother or my little brother? And all the children in school were asked to write an essay on what they would do if they got $1 million. And all of the children wrote industriously what they would do, all except John, and he just did nothing, and he just looked at the ceiling. And the teacher says, all the other children wrote out an essay what they would do, and all you did was nothing. You just looked at the ceiling. And John says, that's what I'd do if I got $1 million. And when Mrs. Baxter had a party, and little Jeannie came home, Jeannie's mother says, did you thank Mrs. Baxter for that nice party she gave the children? And Jeannie says, well, I was going to, but as we were going out the door, the girl in front of me thanked Mrs. Baxter for the party. And Mrs. Baxter says, don't mention it, so I didn't. And Harry was asked, he says, I understand, or somebody was talking to him, he says, I understand that brunettes have sweeter personalities than redheads or blondes. And Harry says, I don't think so. He says, my wife has been all three, and I never saw any difference at all. And Mrs. Morgan was teaching the kids the alphabet, and she said to the class, what comes after the letter T? And the class in unison said, V. So a man was walking down this street, clad only in a barrel, and the policeman said, are you a poker player? And the man says, no, but I just came from some people who were. In a small town, there's not much to see, but what you hear really makes up for it. And a woman was making out an application for credit, and she hesitated for a long time when it came to the part that said to give her age. And finally a clerk says, ma'am, the worse it gets, the longer you wait. And Billy says that if the Lord gives us our daily bread, and if Santa Claus brings all the Christmas presents, and if the stork brings all the babies, what good is it to have Daddy around? Joe says that TV is a device for people who do not have a thing to do, to watch people who cannot do a thing. The only people who will gladly listen to both sides of an argument are the people on the other end of the party line. Elsie said to Elaine, this jewelry once belonged to a millionaire. And Elaine says, really? What was his name? And Elsie says, Woolworth. Little Peter went to the hospital to have his tonsils out, and when he came back, he told all of his little young friends, he says, the nurses over there, they walk around and they're wearing blindfolds over their mouths. And John has a new baby, and he was telling everybody how much the new baby enjoys his company. John says, because he says, I know this for a fact, he says, because while I'm away at work, the baby sleeps, and he says, and when I'm home at night, the baby stays up all night. And Paul said, Daddy, what does college bread mean? And Daddy says, it means a 4-year loaf with the flavor of youth made out of the old man's dough. This is Glendora, a cheerful look at life, folks. Now keep your courage flaming. Enjoy the people who were from the newspapers here tonight?
Oh, very much. They're both, as you say, newspaper men, and they reminded me of my 36 years as a reporter in Springfield, Massachusetts, and in Buffalo. Both of them know people that I know, and particularly Mr. Bacardi of the Associated Press, who asked about Mr. Kirkover, who was the editor of the Buffalo News for so many years and who made it the good newspaper that it was. And he also knew John Laird, who was managing editor of the Richmond, Virginia newspapers, and who once offered me a job.
Well, that was very good. Thank you for adding your part to this. We appreciate that, Mr. Buell.
Oh, thank you.
went to school there?
I did. St. Peter's College was the final school.
St. Peter's College. And what did you take as an undergraduate?
Well, I took an English major, which with the intention of writing someday.
Right.
Well, the paper folded, went out of business, and the next step was to the Associated Press, which is a wire service that serves a lot of newspapers.
Yes.
And that was back to reporting again.
Oh,
And then from there, I joined up with Gannett.
You joined up from Gannett. Now, what did you do at AP? What were you reporting?
State news in New Jersey, at
State
the
news
State
in
House.
New Jersey.
Right.
And then you ended up with Gannett.
Right.
Uh-huh.
I moved across the hall to Gannett. Which, actually, it's Gannett, by the way.
Oh, it is Gannett.
The emphasis on the net.
Okay, I want to get that straight. It is Gannett.
Right.
Because you know who told me, the man who's in charge of the Center for Media Studies at Columbia University, you know him.
Right. It's Everett.
Yeah, Everett
Dennis.
Dennis. He told me that yours was Gannett and the one up in Maine was Gannett.
No, we're Gannett.
You're Gannett.
Yes, we are Gannett.
You are
The
Gannett.
chairman of our company likes to say the emphasis is on the net.
He does.
Yes.
Okay, I got that straight. So
Okay.
it's Gannett.
Right.
I thought.
Interesting place to be a reporter. And then USA Today came along, which is owned by my company, and I was the correspondent for USA Today in New York for the next 3 years.
You were a correspondent for USA Today for
Doing-
3 years.
Right.
Gee, that was interesting. Just tell us a little bit about that, what it consisted of.
Well, we've all heard of Bernard Goetz by now. It consisted of writing about Mr. Goetz and his troubles on the subway with 4 youths he said were trying to rob him.
Yes.
Jerry Ferraro,
Yes.
the first woman to write for vice president. I
Yes.
covered her.
Yes.
Let me see what else was going on around there. Actually, it was mostly police news.
Police news.
Or business
And
news,
you
one
were
or the
so-
other.
Yeah, that's how you started out.
Right. It's not a dying business. There are an awful lot of newspapers still reporting the news in this country and doing a good job of it.
And now, boys and girls, Mr. Louis Bacardi, who is the president and general manager of the Associated Press, is kind enough to come and see you tonight, along with his son, Mark. Louis, you were born where?
In New York City, in the Bronx.
You were? And you went to school where?
I went to school there and to Fordham Prep.
Oh, you went to Fordham?
And then Fordham College.
Yes.
And after that, I went to Columbia University, where I received a master's degree.
A master's degree. Now, first of all, what did you take at Fordham, undergraduate?
I studied journalism. I had begun my interest in journalism when I was in high school.
Really? You got.
I was the editor of the high school paper, which is something I'd urge everybody to be interested in if they're interested in the field at all.
Good thing. And what got you interested in newspapers so early?
I really don't know. I was lucky. I think most young people get to be a lot older than I was in high school without any idea of what they want to do. But sort of early on, I enjoyed the idea of writing stories and having other people read them. And the high school paper gave me a great chance to do that.
Oh, I think that's terrific. Was there some adult who was interested in newspapering?
I remember talking with my dad about it, and he encouraged me, but it was something that I wanted to do.
And then at Fordham, you took to journalism, and when you got your master's at Columbia, that must have been in journalism.
That's right.
And your first job out of Columbia?
Was in New York at a newspaper that's not published any longer, although I didn't have anything to do with that, I should add. The World Telegram was the name of it.
The World Telegram. Remember it well. And what, you were a reporter on there?
I began as a reporter and did all the sorts of things that young reporters have to do, and some of them aren't very exciting. That's just the way you start in this business.
Well.
And then later on, it got a little more interesting, and then I decided I wanted to become an editor.
An editor?
So that I would have the chance to have more to do with more stories. And then I switched from reporting to editing.
Was that on the World Telegram?
That's right.
And
I was there a total of about 6 years, and then I went with the Associated Press and began there as an editor and have had various editing jobs at the AP.
An editor of the Associated Press in New York.
That's right. I'm an anomaly among AP people. Most AP people have worked somewhere else in the world. I'm a New Yorker.
You never left, I guess. What does an editor in New York do on the AP? What did you do?
The AP is a news service, and our job is to provide news stories and pictures and voice tapes and a little bit of television footage to newspapers or radio stations or television stations all over the country. And so our job in New York, which is our headquarters, is to direct that news coverage and the preparation of those stories for all those different people.
And as an editor, did you decide what stories were going to be covered?
That's part of an editor's job, exactly. You decide what the reporters will cover, and you also decide what shape the story should have, what information is important, what things need to be explained so that when people read the story in the newspaper that it makes some sense to them.
And then that was sent all over the place.
The AP has distributes its news all over the world.
By wire. I bet nowadays you do it by satellite, maybe?
Indeed.
Yeah,
It used to be by very slow wire.
Slow wire was
Now
slow,
it's by very fast satellites.
Now, and then what was the next step up from that?
For me,
Yes.
I became the managing editor, which is the second level editorial job in the AP, and then I became executive editor, which is what I guess you'd call editor-in-chief if we had that title.
What does a managing editor do?
The managing editor is the person who is right in the midst of the coverage. His job is to be in the middle of everything that's going on and to direct the staff through people under him, of course, around the world. The executive editor is the next step above him, and then above that, president, which is the
Well,
job
the
I have
president.
now.
Now, the executive editor, is that more or less administration?
Well, no, some administration. She's the senior news executive, and let me, that's a fun job.
It is? You tell us why?
Because you're involved in so many interesting things, so many difficult things, that if anything happens anywhere in the world, in the state, in the region, it's something you need to know about, and that's very interesting.
And you know it first, right?
Well, you hope you know it first. Sometimes you don't.
Now, how many years is this at AP?
I've been at AP about 20 years.
Executive editor. Okay, and you were made president when?
I was made president 2.5 years ago.
So for this is about the 18th year that you're the executive editor.
I've been there for 20 years. 18 years, for 18 years, I was either the managing editor or the executive editor. And then about 2.5 years ago, I became president.
Back, he's going to describe to you the work of the president, see if you'd like to aim for that as a career, and then he's going to give you some ideas how you could get started in news today. And this is a chat with Glendora. Now, Mr. Bacardi, why don't you tell the boys and girls what the work as president of the Associated Press consists of? Give us an idea of it from day to day.
Well, day to day, it's pretty busy.
Is it? Yeah.
As the chief executive of the company, the president is responsible for everything the company does. You're responsible for the news we produce, the people who produce the news, our financial health, the equipment, and so on. You have general responsibility for the welfare of the company.
Now, for instance, what did you do today, Mr. Bacardi?
Well, today was a day devoted mostly to meetings on financial matters by chance. On another day, it might be mostly news matters or personnel deciding about transferring people or promoting them, or some days there's more time for what we call membership work, which is the sales of our services to the newspapers and the broadcasters and others who take what we produce. It's a very varied menu, and there really isn't a typical day.
No, of course not.
Except that they manage to be full somehow.
They're all very full. It's very creative, though, I think, running a company like that.
Well, like in a creative way, it's challenging because in any business today, whether it's the news, which itself is always changing, or really
Yes.
any business, you really have to be pretty flexible and pretty creative.
Yes. Now, there's a lot of meetings, I can see that. There's a lot of telephoning.
Yes, indeed.
Mm-hmm. Do you travel much?
Yes, I travel about a third of the time, some of it in the United States and some of it abroad. As I said earlier, we distribute our news all over the world, and so there are many occasions when I must be in other countries to do business or to visit with some of the people we work with, or to visit with our staff.
What do you like best about it, Mr. Bacardi?
I guess I like being in the news business because news itself is so interesting.
Yeah, it's always fascinated you.
It has.
Since your young boy days in the Bronx. What advice would you give a youngster to get started today?
Well, I think if you're interested in news, that you really need to think about beginning as a reporter. And that means that you need to develop a sense of curiosity. You need to develop your ability to write. So beginning to ask questions, to be able to express yourself, and when you find out the answers to the questions, be able to express them in writing is something you want to start to try to do fairly early. Now, when you get on a little further into the college level, there's a big discussion that goes on about whether or not you should major in journalism. I think that's fine if you do, and there are other things you can major in as well, because if you think about it, there's nothing that as a reporter you can say, well, I'll never have to know anything about that, because one day you might be covering something to do with the stock market, and another day you might be talking to somebody whose business it is to run a chain of grocery stores. The news is so varied that really almost any area that you have an interest in is something that might at some point be very useful to you as a news person. But I think the two things for young people, for people at the high school level and maybe just getting a little beyond that, are to develop your sense of curiosity and learn how to write. And one of the ways you do that, I think, is to read. Read a great deal. Read almost everything you can find. And as you get a little bit older, you don't just read for the enjoyment of it, although I hope you keep doing that, but what you do is read to look a little bit at how this person, the writer, expressed what they were trying to communicate. So you begin to understand a little bit. And of course at the high school level too, working on the school newspaper I think is a great way to begin. And it might tell you that this really isn't something you'd want to do for the rest of your life, which is fine too.
Well, listening to you, a person could hardly believe that.
Well, it's not a job for everyone, obviously, and if you get involved in something like your school paper in high school, or perhaps your college paper after high school, that's a good way to give you at least an idea of what it's like. And nothing can be as real as that first job in a newsroom, but still, working on your school paper will give you some sense of it.
Yes. Well, Mr. Bacardi, we want to thank you very much for coming to see us.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, we've waited a long time for you to come. We really appreciate it. And
Thank you.
now, yes, I'd like to get a picture of your son, Mark. Just a second.
If that,
Mark, what is your favorite sport?
Football.
Football? And
Yes.
who's your favorite team?
The Dallas Cowboys.
Dallas Cowboys? And who is your favorite player?
Probably Herschel Walker.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Well, yeah, he's a good one. And you go to what school now?
Iona Grammar.
And that's in New Rochelle?
Yes.
Yes. And you have nice teachers, right?
Yes.
What's your favorite subject?
Math.
Math?
Yes.
And what's your favorite TV show?
I don't really have a favorite, just sports I like to watch.
You just watch sports?
Yes.
Right. Well, you like the one with Alex Keaton, don't you?
Yeah, Family Ties.
Yeah, Family Ties. Thanks a lot, Mark, for coming over and being the chief assistant here for your father on the program.
Thanks.
Take care.
That was about 1972.
1972.
And in 1981, we started having some conversations with BBDO, and BBDO acquired Tracy Locke.
Oh, that was it. It was Tracy Locke. That's a famous name.
You know that name, Glendora?
Yes, I certainly do.